Robert Shurtleff came late to the American Revolution. He enlisted in the Continental Army after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, which ended the principal military campaigns in North America. New recruits were scarce in a country exhausted by war. Attracted by cash bounties, beardless young men who had been mere children in 1775 now stepped forward. Claiming to be 18, Shurtleff was single, poor, and at loose ends. But he proved to be a talented soldier and won assignment to an elite infantry unit, part of Washington's army of 10,000 men stationed north of New York City. That is, 10,000 men and one woman. Robert Shurtleff was actually Deborah Sampson, aged 23, from Massachusetts. For 17 months, Sampson served as a man, marching through woods, skirmishing with the enemy, and enduring the monotony of military life. With privacy at a minimum, she faced constant risk of discovery. Why did she take the chance? A hard-luck childhood had left Sampson impoverished and unusually plucky. Placed in foster care at age 5, Deborah became a servant in a succession of families. Along the way, she learned to plow a field and read and write, uncommon skills for a female servant. Next, she became a weaver and then a teacher. Marriage should have been her following step, but the wartime shortage of men probably kept Deborah masterless and poor. The cash bounty enticed her to enlist. During her first engagement outside Tarrytown, New York, Sampson took 2 musket balls to her thigh and was grazed in the head by another. Her comrades tried to rush her to the surgeon, but she begged them not to take her, as her disguise would be discovered. But they took her anyway, and fortunately for her, sort of, the doctor was so busy with worse cases that he quickly bound up her head wound and ran off to deal with those other patients. She took a penknife and a sewing needle and dug one of the balls out of her leg herself, but the other was too deep to reach and it stayed there the rest of her life. Later, while serving garrison duty in Philadelphia, Sampson fell ill, and there an army physician discovered her masquerade. While he promised to keep her secret, other officials eventually discovered Sampson's sex, and then she was immediately discharged, though honorably. Sampson eventually got married and settled in Stoughton, Massachusetts, giving birth to 3 children. She petitioned the federal government for a pension awarded to Continental Army veterans but was denied, after which she sent a petition to the Massachusetts state legislature in 1792. The governor, John Hancock, granted her an annual pension of £34 plus interest backdated to her discharge in 1783. She published a book about her adventures in 1797, and in 1802 went on a fairly successful speaking tour during which she would appear in her old Army uniform, a remarkable crossing of gender boundaries at a time when women were rarely allowed to speak in public. But she did not do this just because it was a fun way for her to recount her unusual life story. Her family was in dire financial straits, and they desperately needed the little bit of money from book sales and from proceeds from her lectures. Paul Revere, whom she had befriended during the war, oftentimes gave her money to help out, and in 1804 he successfully lobbied Congress to grant her disability payments of $4 a month. In 1809, she applied for an increase in her monthly payments and that they should have been made retroactive to her discharge in 1783, but she was denied. However, in 1816, a second petition was approved and her pension was adjusted to almost $77 per year, roughly $1,500 in today's money. Although Sampson's was an extreme case, many Americans experienced the disruptions of the revolutionary movement. Wartime shortages pushed women into typically male jobs. Soldiers fought for ideas, but they also fought for money. Hardship struck everywhere. Sampson's quest for personal independence, freedom from the constraints of female life, echoed the broader quest for national independence. Despite the outcome, few people yearned for political independence in 1775. Some never yearned for it at all. Long after fighting began, the Continental Congress continued to seek reconciliation with Britain. It raised and financed an army and sought alliances with foreign countries, all the while making diplomatic proposals for peace. When King George III rejected all peace overtures, however, most Americans never looked back. The war moved into high gear. In part a classic war with professional armies, the Revolutionary War was also a civil war between rebels and Loyalists. It had complex ethnic dimensions. pitting many Native American peoples allied with the British against some allied with the Americans, and providing unprecedented opportunities for enslaved African Americans to win freedom. And it was an international war, spreading far beyond North America, pulling in France, Spain, and other European powers, extending across multiple continents and continuing for years after most fighting ended in America. On May 10, 1775, nearly 1 month after the fighting at Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia. It immediately set to work on two crucial but contradictory tasks: to raise an army and to pursue reconciliation with Britain. For the former, Congress needed soldiers and money. For the latter, it needed cautious diplomacy. But the king was not receptive, and as the war continued into 1776, hopes of reconciliation faded. British colonists began to ponder a future that only a few years earlier would have been unthinkable: national independence. The delegates to the Second Continental Congress were prominent local figures, but as the fighting began in Massachusetts, they suddenly climbed onto a continental stage. The outbreak of war provoked sharp disagreement among them. The cousins John and Samuel Adams stood at the radical end of the spectrum, already favoring independence. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, by contrast, made famous from his 1767 publication, Letters from a Farmer, hoped for reconciliation with Britain. Given the extraordinary stakes of the debate, any of the delegates could have been executed for treason. Their general inexperience and their divergent opinions building consensus proved difficult. Few delegates were yet prepared to break with Britain. Some maintained passionate loyalty to the monarchy, while others feared the risks of losing the British Empire's protection against France and Spain. Almost all remained intensely attached to their identity as British subjects. Economic motivations also played a factor. Merchants and planters worried that independence would undermine the colony's economy. Nor were such feelings limited to the delegates. Few ordinary colonists envisioned complete independence at this stage. From the Stamp Act of 1765 to the Coercive Acts of 1774, the constitutional struggle with Britain had focused on questions of parliamentary power. Almost no one had challenged the monarchy itself. The men who, in one way or another, asserted colonial American rights under the British Constitution, which, by the way, is not a document that you can go see at the British Museum or the Public Record Office in London, but is rather just the accumulated body of common law and documents such as the 1689 Bill of Rights. These men were known as Whigs, which was the liberal wing of British politics in the 18th century. Ironically, when King George III was completing his formal education, his best friends and tutors were of the Whig persuasion. But what begins to become very clear in 1774 and 75 is that American politics was overwhelmingly Whig in orientation, with the New England and Virginia delegations representing a radical vanguard. But this is not to say that even they really wanted independence at that point. Rather, they floated the idea in order to bring the most reluctant conservative delegates to support resolutions asserting American rights and alleged British violations of those rights. For all the disagreements about the ultimate course of events, the Congress could not sit idly by. The events in Massachusetts demanded some reaction. Even moderates supported a military buildup in response to the British incursions. On June 14th, the Congress voted to create the Continental Army, choosing George Washington as commander-in-chief. The choice of a Virginian to lead an army in defense of New England signaled continent-wide support for the effort. To pay for the military buildup, the Congress authorized a currency issue of $2 million. Continental dollars were merely paper, not backed by gold or silver. Delegates naively expected that soldiers, farmers, munitions suppliers, and others would accept the new currency on good faith. In just 2 months, the Second Continental Congress had created an army, gone to war, and issued its own currency. Although it had not declared independence, it had nonetheless assumed the principal functions of government. After the hostilities in Lexington and Concord, British troops retreated to the peninsula of Boston, leaving the insurgents in control of the countryside. In the months that followed, New England militia units fortified the hilly terrain of Charlestown across the Charles River from the city. Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, found himself besieged in Boston and could only wait for reinforcements. When they finally arrived, he decided to take the offensive. General William Howe, who had just arrived from Britain, insisted on a bold frontal attack with 2,500 soldiers. After 3 bloody assaults, the British took Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill was a British victory, but a costly one. British dead numbered 226 with more than 800 wounded. The insurgents suffered 140 dead, 271 wounded, and 30 captured. Instead of pursuing the fleeing insurgents, Howe retreated to Boston, unwilling to risk more raids into the countryside. If British commanders had realized the weakness of the American units around Boston, they might have defeated the Continental Army in its infancy. Instead, they remained in Boston, only to abandon it without a fight 9 months later. Howe used his time in Boston to inoculate his army against smallpox because a new epidemic was spreading across colonial port cities. Inoculation worked by producing a mild but real, and therefore risky, case of smallpox, followed by lifelong immunity. Howe made a wise decision. During the American Revolution, some 130,000 people on the continent, most of them Indians, died of smallpox. General Washington arrived to take command of the new Continental Army a week after Bunker Hill. He found enthusiastic but undisciplined troops. Washington attributed the disarray to the New England custom of letting militia units elect their own officers, which he believed undermined military authority. The Virginian moved quickly to impose more hierarchy and authority. While military preparations moved forward, the Second Continental Congress pursued its second and contradictory objective, reconciliation with Britain. Delegates from the Middle Colonies, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York, still hoped for a peaceful resolution. In July 1775, congressional moderates led by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania engineered an appeal to the king called the Olive Branch Petition, affirming the colonists' loyalty to the monarchy and blaming the troubles on the king's ministers and on Parliament. As a solution to the crisis, it proposed that American colonial assemblies be recognized as individual parliaments under the monarchy. Unfortunately for the moderates, King George III rejected the Olive Branch Petition, and Parliament passed the Prohibitory Act in December 1775, which declared the Continental Congress and all affiliated bodies to be illegal and null and void in terms of their authority. It declared the 13 mainland North American British colonies to be in a state of rebellion against King George III. And finally, it declared that all rebels are beyond the king's protection and therefore can be dealt with as a foreign enemy in war until proper royal authority was restored. By undermining the position of those who still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, the defeat of the Olive Branch Petition advanced the case of delegates who favored independence. Pressure for independence started to mount in January 1776 when a pamphlet titled Common Sense appeared in Philadelphia. Thomas Paine, its author, was an English artisan, radical, and coffeehouse intellectual who had sailed to America in the fall of 1774. He quickly launched himself into the movement for American independence and wrote Common Sense to advance the cause. In simple yet forceful language, Paine portrayed the British monarchy as an absurd institution. Why, he asked, should one man have the power to rule by sheer accident of birth? One of the strongest natural proofs of the folly of hereditary rights in kings is that nature disapproves it. Otherwise, she would not so frequently turn it into ridicule by giving mankind an ass for a lion. Calling the British king an ass broke through the deep well of deference most colonists still felt for the monarchy. Instead, Paine called for republican government based on the consent of the governed. Rulers, according to Paine, represented the people. The best form of government relied on frequent elections to keep rulers accountable. Paine went on to point out that the American colonies did not depend on Great Britain nearly as much as Britain depended upon the importation from America of raw materials and food. To wit, I have heard it asserted by some that as America hath flourished under her former connection with Great Britain, that the same connection is necessary towards her future happiness. Nothing can be more fallacious than this kind of argument. America would have flourished as much, and probably much more, had no European power had anything to do with her. The commerce by which she hath enriched herself are the necessaries of life, and will always have a market while eating is the custom of Europe. And finally, in a ringing announcement that Americans should seek their independence from a decrepit, aged Britain, he declared, "O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny, but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind." Paine's pamphlet sold more than 150,000 copies in a matter of weeks. Newspapers reprinted it. Men read it aloud in taverns and coffee houses. John Adams sent a copy to his wife Abigail, who passed it around to her neighbors in Braintree, Massachusetts. Although many New Englanders already favored independence, people in other colonies remained cautious. Paine's pamphlet helped end the hesitation, pushing them to take the great leap of abandoning the British Empire and monarchy along with it. Abigail Adams did not just yearn for independence. She also sought to broaden the movement by extending it beyond the ranks of white male colonists. In a series of letters to her husband, Adams highlighted the limitations of the intellectual ferment. "I have sometimes been ready to think that the passion for liberty cannot be equally strong in the breasts of those who have been accustomed to deprive their fellow creatures of theirs," she wrote of Southern slave owners. In another letter, she called for an expansion of women's legal rights. "In the new code of laws which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." Adams pointed to the legal dominion that men exercised over their wives. "Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands," she warned. "Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Now, Abigail Adams is not advocating that women should have the right to vote or the right to hold elected office, but she is arguing for the abolition of certain laws that disabled women from owning property and operating independently of husbands and fathers and even sometimes elder brothers. But John dismissed his wife's concerns. But to other male politicians, Adams reviewed the reasons for excluding women and men who were black or young or lacking property from political participation. Although he defended existing social hierarchies, Abigail's letter forced him to ponder the logic behind their exclusion, something few men or women did in 1776. One factor pushing the colonies toward independence was the prospect of an alliance with France. French authorities saw the brewing rebellion in Britain's colonies as an opportunity to strike a blow against their arch-rival by breaking up the British Empire. They secretly provided money and supplies, but before they were willing to openly support the colonies, French officials wanted some assurance that the quarrel would end in independence, not reconciliation, and also that they would not do the lion's share of the fighting while the Americans sat back. News that British authorities were planning to hire German mercenary soldiers further boosted popular support for independence. By May 1776, all but 4 colonies were agitating for a declaration. Moderates were still hoping for reconciliation, but the political momentum was rapidly shifting away from them. In early June, the Virginia delegation introduced a resolution calling for independence. Moderates still commanded enough support to postpone a vote until July, however. In the meantime, the Congress appointed a committee which included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Richard Sherman, and John Livingston to draft a document making the case. At their first committee meeting, Adams, Jefferson, Livingston, and Sherman all deferred to Franklin, easily the most famous man in the Atlantic world and a gifted writer, but he refused, arguing that he was not accustomed to anything he had written to be edited by someone else, much less by such a contentious body as the Congress. He suggested that Adams would be a better candidate to author a declaration, but Adams deferred in favor of Jefferson, whom he thought 10 times a better writer than he and much better regarded on a personal level than he. Finally, he argued that a Virginian ought to be at the head of this business, since up to this point, most of the agitation against British rule came from Massachusetts. Virginia, being the eldest of Britain's American children, as it were, should symbolically lead the independence movement, and so Jefferson retired to his boarding room Virginia, being the eldest of Britain's American children, as it were, should symbolically lead the independence movement, and so Jefferson retired to his boarding house room to spend most of June drafting the Declaration. It took the form of a statement of universal natural rights as defined by the 17th century English political philosopher John Locke, followed by a list of injuries and usurpations committed by King George III personally against his former American subjects. The most remarkable of these came near the end of the original draft, in which he wrote, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce." Now this is extraordinary. A slave owner writing such a ringing damnation of the slave trade and, whether he meant to or not, of slavery itself in a document that elsewhere states that all men are created equal and have the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the latter meaning the right to own property and real estate. Historians and political philosophers have struggled to figure out what Jefferson meant with this clause, since if it had not been edited out of the Declaration would almost certainly have forced the abolition of slavery in the new United States should the Revolution succeed. He would have had to have been aware that his fellow delegates from the southern states would never accept such a thing and argue for the clause's deletion as their first order of business. In the event that somehow the Congress would have allowed it to stay in and made good on its implicit promise to abolish slavery in keeping with the revolutionaries' libertarianism and egalitarianism, then that would have meant for Jefferson a dramatic change in his personal fortunes, since he would likely have had to let go of all or at least most of his labor force that generated the plantation wealth that made him so prominent a man in the first place. Without that, he would have lost his status as a gentleman, and that would have spelled the end of his political career. So why did he do it? I would argue that Jefferson is playing the magician. How does a magician trick you into believing that the illusion is real? By distraction. They do or say something that takes your attention away from seeing what's really going on, and I think that the slave trade clause is just such a distraction. It certainly is going to attract attention. Slave owners are not going to like it and urge for its removal. Others are going to spot the obvious hypocrisy of it and argue that it doesn't belong in the Declaration. Still others are going to see that there is no way that King George III can logically be responsible for the existence of the slave trade, since it began with the Portuguese and the Spanish over 2 centuries ago at that point, and King James I did not issue any mandate that the first Africans be taken to Virginia in 1619. The worst you could say is that Britain's kings profited from the slave trade, but neither George III nor his predecessors started it, and Jefferson is wildly exaggerating when he suggests that any of the colonies tried to end or limit the slave trade and the king prevented them from doing so. But see what Jefferson did in this original draft. He referred to the slaves as men, and he wrote the word in all capital letters, which draws the eye. Nowhere else in the Declaration's main text did he put any other word in all caps. Where else does he refer to men? At the beginning of the document, of course, where he wrote, quote, "All men are created equal." Now, what does he mean by the word men? It could literally mean just men, but at that time and up until the end of the 20th century, it was customary to refer to all of humanity using the words man, men, or mankind. And so most likely he is using a gendered term as a collective term. He could have meant only white men, but he used men to describe Africans and African Americans, so that one is out. He could have been narrowly defining men as white property owners like himself, but again, slaves are not property owners, so again, he could not have been thinking in such narrow terms. I think that if Jefferson had said nothing about slavery, that some members of the Congress might have tried to parse his language about all men being equal, but by drawing their attention to the end of the document, the use of the term men at the beginning was never questioned and made it untouched to the final version of the Declaration. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what Jefferson or any of the members of Congress thought the word men meant, because it is a universal statement of human rights to life, liberty, and property ownership. Women like Abigail Adams and Judith Sargent Murray read the word to mean women as well, and of course slaves knew that all men are created equal with rights to life and liberty meant that they should never have been enslaved and deserved immediate emancipation, though precious few dared to say so publicly. Needless to say, the Southern delegates cried foul and demanded the clause's removal, which was done, and numerous other changes resulted in what Jefferson complained was a ruined declaration. Franklin almost certainly nodded knowingly to Jefferson as he sat fuming as this and that delegate argued for this to be removed and that to be reworded, and so on. On July 2nd, after intense debate, the Continental Congress voted for independence, and on July 4th, the amendments to Jefferson's text were complete and the Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. In August, the delegates gathered to sign the official parchment copy. 4 men, including John Dickinson, declined to sign. Several others, quote, signed with regret and many doubts, according to John Adams. 4 men, including John Dickinson, declined to sign. Several others signed with regret and with many doubts, according to John Adams. The document was then printed, widely distributed, and read aloud in celebrations everywhere. Printed copies omitted the signers' names. They had committed treason, a crime punishable by death. On the day of signing, they indulged in gallows humor. When Benjamin Franklin paused for a moment, John Hancock of Massachusetts teased him. Come, sir, we must be unanimous. No pulling different ways. We must all hang together. Franklin replied, Indeed, we must all hang together. Otherwise, we shall most assuredly hang separately. Both sides approached the war with uneasiness. The United States, with inexperienced militias made up mostly of farmers and artisans, had begun a war against the mightiest military power in the Atlantic world. With virtually no money, the upstart nation confronted the kingdom with the most sophisticated financial system of any global power. And notwithstanding the name of the new country, it lacked unity. Many Americans remained loyal to Britain. On the other hand, British forces faced serious obstacles as well. The logistics of supplying an army across 3,000 miles of ocean with 18th century technologies of travel and communication were daunting to say the least. These patterns, undertrained American troops faced off against British troops reluctant to press their military advantage, played out repeatedly in the first year of the war. Defense in the colonies had long rested with militias composed of all able-bodied men over age 16. Militias, however, were best suited for local and limited engagements, for responding to slave rebellions or for conflict with American Indians. The United States now needed an army. Congress initially set the term of enlistment at 1 year, which proved inadequate. Incentives produced longer commitments. A $20 bonus for 3 years of service, 100 acres of land for enlistment until the war's end, a reward valid only if the United States won. Over the course of the war, some 230,000 men enlisted, totaling roughly 1/4 of the white adult male population. Women also served in the Continental Army, cooking, washing, nursing the wounded, and in a few instances, of course, disguised as men and fighting in the ranks like Deborah Sampson. The British Army established a ratio of 1 woman to every 10 men. In the Continental Army, the ratio was set at 1 woman to 15 men. Close to 20,000 camp followers, as they were called, served during the war, many of them wives of men in service. Approximately 12,000 children also tagged along, and babies were born in the camps. Some women helped during battles, supplying drinking water or ammunition to soldiers. A most famous example is Mary Hayes, wife of American artilleryman William Hayes, who carried water to thirsty soldiers during and between battles, thus earning her the nickname Molly Pitcher. In June 1778, during the Battle of Monmouth, her husband was killed and she took his place swapping the cannon between shots. At one point, a British cannonball bouncing along the ground passed between her legs and tore off much of her skirt, and she is said to have joked that it was a good thing that the ball had not carried off something more valuable than just her skirt. After the battle, General Washington presented her with a commendation for meritorious service. At first, the Continental Army excluded African Americans, but as manpower needs increased, northern states welcomed free blacks into service, while slaves in some states could serve with their master's permission. In all, about 5,000 black men served the United States in the Revolutionary War. However much these men were inspired by the ideals of the Revolution, 23 gave liberty, freedom, and freeman as their surnames at the time of enlistment. The number of black people serving in the American Army paled in comparison to the numbers serving with British forces. Military service helped politicize Americans during the early stage of the war. In 1776, independence was a risky, potentially treasonous idea. But as many people discovered, apathy had its dangers as well. Those who refused to serve risked being called traitors to the revolutionary cause. As the war continued, neutrality became more difficult to maintain, and military service offered a way of demonstrating political allegiance. The American Army was raw and inexperienced and often woefully undermanned. It never developed the precision and discipline of European professional armies, but it was not as ineffectual as British officers continually assumed. The American Army did not have to win the war. It merely had to survive. As a consequence, American military objectives were straightforward: to repulse an invading army and avoid any catastrophic military defeats. The British strategy, on the other hand, was not as clear. Imperial authorities wanted to put down the rebellion and restore the Crown's power in the colonies. But how? A decisive defeat of the Continental Army was essential, but would not in itself end the rebellion. An armed and angry insurgent population would remain. Nor could the rebellion be defeated by an assault on some political nerve center. There were 13 distinct political entities to capture, pacify, and then restore to the Crown, stretching 1,000 miles from New Hampshire to Georgia. Indeed, during the war, British forces would capture and occupy every major port city. In a continent whose population was 95% rural, however, such victories mattered little. Charged with restoring the old governments, not destroying an enemy country, British generals could not win by ravaging the countryside or burning villages. Unwilling to confiscate food from Americans, the British needed hundreds of supply ships and ports in which to land them. The British also depended on the support of Americans who remained loyal to the Crown and would help the British war effort. It was therefore imperative not to alienate them. British military strategy aimed to divide and conquer the colonies, focusing first on New York. In addition to having the greatest number of loyal subjects, New York offered an important geographic advantage. If British forces could control the Hudson River, they would isolate New England from the middle and southern colonies. Squeezed between a naval blockade along the coast and an army in the west, Massachusetts would be forced to surrender. New Jersey and Pennsylvania would then fall in line, British strategists hoped, as loyal British subjects took back power. Virginia posed a problem, but the British believed that Loyalist support in the Carolinas would eventually help them isolate and subdue the colony. With the British firmly entrenched in Boston after the setback at Bunker Hill, the Massachusetts and Connecticut legislatures independently concluded that ejecting the British from there was imperative to American objectives. Benedict Arnold, a prosperous Connecticut merchant, noted to Heman Allen, an acquaintance, that Fort Ticonderoga was full of munitions, including many pieces of heavy artillery that could be placed on the hills surrounding Boston. Unbeknownst to Arnold, Allen rushed to Hartford to propose just such an expedition. Connecticut thus commissioned Allen and his more famous brother, Ethan Allen, of what would become Vermont, to lead an expedition to take the fort with his Green Mountain Boys. Arnold pitched the same idea to the Massachusetts legislature, which granted him a commission as a colonel in the state militia to lead its expedition to take the fort. Arnold and Allen ran into each other as their respective forces approached the fort, and while they argued over who was in overall command, the New Englanders easily took the practically undefended fort. Arnold later departed to seek a commission as an officer in the Continental Army, while Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller, arrived at the fort under General Washington's orders with an ambitious plan to move the heavy cannons of the fort to surround Boston and hopefully force General Thomas Gage to evacuate his army. In a feat that Washington likened to the Carthaginian general Hannibal's invasion of Italy over the Alps, Knox proved himself as both a leader and logistical genius. As Knox and Benedict Arnold had hoped, the placing of Ticonderoga's heavy guns on the hills surrounding Boston convinced General Gage that his position was indefensible. At any moment, he feared, the Americans may open up with those heavy guns that could reach the Royal Navy ships positioned in the waters around Boston proper, as well as his own troop emplacements. The victory at Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill had been very costly, but the prospect of repeating such Pyrrhic victories several more times against far greater numbers of Americans, now under General Washington's leadership, without reinforcements that General Howe could not spare, led Gage to decide to evacuate the city in March 1776. If only he had known that the Americans had very little powder to fire those cannons, and if he had chosen to call the Americans bluff, the city might have stayed in British hands for the duration of the war. In late 1775, the United States launched an ambitious expedition to capture the cities of Montreal and Quebec before British reinforcements could arrive, and thus bring Canada into the United States. The Americans hoped that the French-Canadian population, only recently conquered by the British, would rise in support of their cause. A force of New York Continentals commanded by General Richard Montgomery took Montreal in September 1775 and then advanced on Quebec. Meanwhile, a second contingent of Continentals led by Colonel Benedict Arnold, who had received his commission from Washington, moved north through Maine to Quebec, a punishing trek through deep snow with woefully inadequate supplies. Arnold showed heroic determination, but close to half of his men either died or turned back during the march. Arnold and Montgomery jointly attacked Quebec in December, but failed to take the city. During the fighting to take the city, Arnold took a musket ball to his right leg, and an army surgeon decided the ball was lodged too deep and that the leg should be amputated. But Arnold insisted that the surgeon dig the ball out rather than lose his leg, and luckily for him, the procedure was successful and he did not develop a gangrenous infection of the wound that would have forced the amputation anyway to save his life, as the doctor predicted. Worse yet, the army experienced a smallpox outbreak which killed more men than the battle did. Meanwhile, the French-Canadian population, which had recently gained new civil rights under the Quebec Act of 1774, remained mostly neutral. The Canada expedition proved a costly failure for the United States. Meanwhile, Colonel Arnold led the retreat of the Continental Army and New England militias south from Quebec to Fort Ticonderoga on the southern end of Lake Champlain, pursued by the British under General Sir Guy Carleton. Carleton then began a campaign to secure control of Champlain and the Hudson River in order to isolate New England from the rest of the rebelling colonies. This meant putting small and medium-sized Royal Navy ships on the lake, and this Arnold resolved to delay as long as possible. He oversaw the building of as many small gunboats as they had time and materials to construct, taking their light artillery and fitting them to the prows of the boats. They couldn't stop the British from putting the ships onto the lake, but they could do as much damage to them as possible, and this resulted in the Battle of Valcour Island in October 1776. It went about as well as it could have for Arnold, who showed his by now usual bravery and daring in directing the action. According to his officers, Arnold's boat was the last one not sunk or forced to retire, but it had taken heavy damage, and he was busy loading one final round to fire at a pursuing battleship when he was made to abandon the barely floating vessel. Back in New York City, things weren't going much better for Washington. The main action of the war was not in Canada in any case. It was in New York City. In August 1776, some 45,000 British troops, including 8,000 German mercenaries called Hessians, commanded by General Howe, landed south of New York City. General Washington had anticipated this move and marched his army of 20,000 south from Massachusetts to meet them. The very green Continental Army was no match for the well-trained British redcoats, however. Despite being outnumbered, the Americans were well positioned to defend the city, except that they neglected to secure the Jamaica Pass, where Howe sent half of his forces to flank and surround the Continentals. The Americans barely escaped and suffered numerous casualties, while 1,000 men, mostly militia, were taken prisoner. Howe failed to press forward, however, perhaps remembering the terrible costs of his victory at Bunker Hill. Washington successfully evacuated what remained of his army from Long Island. Washington withdrew to the north of Manhattan to two forts on either side of the Hudson River. For 2 months, the armies engaged in limited skirmishing, but in November, Howe captured Fort Washington and Fort Lee, taking another 3,000 prisoners and very nearly defeating the Continental Army. Washington retreated across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. Once again, Howe failed to press his advantage. Instead, he parked his German troops in winter quarters along the Delaware River. Perhaps he knew that many of the Continental soldiers' enlistment periods ended on December 31st and assumed that the Americans would not attack. He was wrong. On the night of December 25th, in an icy rain, Washington stealthily moved his army across the Delaware River. Early the next morning, he attacked the unsuspecting German soldiers who were groggy from a night of Christmas revelry. The victory meant little in military terms, but after a series of humiliating defeats, the Continental Army needed to boost the sagging morale of its troops and of the civilian population. For the next 2 weeks, Washington continued his offensive, capturing supplies and a clever attack on British units at Princeton. Soon he was safe in Morristown in northern New Jersey, where he settled his army for the winter. Washington finally had time to administer mass smallpox inoculations and see his men through the abbreviated course of the disease. All in all, in the first year of the war, the rebellious Americans had a few proud moments but far more defeats. The inexperienced Continental Army had barely survived the New York campaign. Arnold and Washington had shown exceptional daring, but what really saved the Americans was the repeated reluctance of British generals to press their military advantage to victory. Although it did not look promising, the cause of independence remained alive. The dilemma facing the British was a complicated one. Although the Prohibitory Act declared the rebellious Americans as beyond the king's protection and equivalent to a foreign foe, Generals Gage and Howe believed that crushing the Americans on the battlefield would win the war, but it would not lead the way toward winning the peace. They thought that the war should be one waged to win hearts and minds, as well as convince Congress and especially the Continental Army that this war was a war they had no chance of winning. Some of the high-ranking officers thought otherwise, such as General Cornwallis and General Guy Carleton, but they answered to Howe, who thought that showing some measure of restraint would buy him time to win the war with as little bloodshed and expense as possible, while the American commitment to independence would hopefully evaporate. Back in London, a similar conflict played out in parliamentary debates between Whigs who urged the King and Lord North to offer a carrot as well as the stick, while Tories argued that there should be no restraint or mercy shown to the rebels. George III and North both agreed to maintain the hard line. Battles alone did not win or lose the war. Struggles on the home front were just as important. Men who joined the army often left wives in charge of households. Some men and women remained loyal to Britain and opposed the war effort, while many others were undecided. Throughout the United States, supporters of the revolutionary cause used both persuasion and force to gain the allegiance of neutrals. An unstable wartime economy added to the domestic turbulence. The creative financing of the fledgling government brought hardships for many and opportunities for some, presenting Americans with new manifestations of virtue and corruption. As these changes spread through the former colonies, the colonial rebellion was gradually turning into a revolution. Committees of correspondence, public safety, and of inspection dominated the political landscape in patriot communities. These committees took on more tasks than local governance. They enforced boycotts, selected army draftees, and monitored suspected loyalists. They sometimes invaded homes to search for contraband goods such as British tea or textiles. These forceful demonstrations of power and coercion dismayed loyalists. Few people challenged the local committees. Their coercive powers pushed many middle-of-the-road citizens to side with the patriot forces, at least in public, but then also turned many toward the loyalist side. Another group new to political life, white women, demonstrated a capacity for patriotism as wartime hardships upended their lives. Many wives whose husbands left for military or political service took over traditionally masculine duties. As they managed farms and made business decisions, some even asserted themselves in political debates. Eliza Wilkinson managed a South Carolina plantation and talked revolutionary politics with her friends. Women from prominent Philadelphia families took more direct action, forming the Ladies' Association to collect money for Continental soldiers. Mrs. Esther de Bert Reed, wife of Pennsylvania's governor, published a broadside in 1780 titled The Sentiments of an American Woman to defend these new forms of female activism. The time is arrived to display the same sentiments which animated us at the beginning of the Revolution, when we renounced the use of teas and when our Republican and laborious hands spun the flax. Approximately 1/4 of the American population remained loyal to the Crown in 1776, and another third tried to stay neutral, providing a significant base of popular support for the British. A broad and diverse group of Americans, Loyalists opposed the Revolution for a variety of reasons. Some cherished their identity as British subjects and believed that the British Empire was the freest, most liberal government in the world. Many believed in order and hierarchy and saw the self-styled patriots as unscrupulous, violent men grabbing power for themselves and imposing a new form of democratic tyranny. Still others are what are known as Whig Loyalists, meaning that they generally agreed that there had been a rash of bad British policy coming from Parliament and that the Whigs were right about the violations of traditional British rights, but that to resort to independence and war to redress those grievances was doomed to failure and would bring about a worse situation than the one that developed in the 1760s. Most Loyalists could be said to have been of this variety. Pockets of loyalism existed everywhere. The most visible Loyalists, called Tories by their enemies, were royal officials like governors, local judges, and customs officers. Wealthy merchants gravitated toward loyalism to maintain the protections of navigation acts in the British Navy. Conservative urban lawyers admired the stability of British law and order. Some colonists chose loyalism to oppose their political adversaries, like the backcountry Carolina farmers who resented the power of the pro-revolutionary elite. Southern slaves had their own resentments against the slave-owning class and looked to Britain as the power that could bring their freedom. Even New England towns at the heart of the turmoil, such as Concord, Massachusetts, had a small and increasingly silenced core of loyalists. On occasion, fathers and sons and even brothers disagreed completely over the war. White loyalists were most vocal between 1774 and 1776, when a full-scale rebellion against Britain still seemed unlikely. They often challenged the Patriots in the form of printed pamphlets and broadsides. In 1776 in New York City, 547 Loyalists signed and circulated a broadside titled A Declaration of Dependence that rebutted the Congress's July 4th declaration. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress declared all Loyalists to be traitors. Over the next year, state laws specified that acts such as provisioning the British Army, saying anything that undermined Patriot morale, and discouraging men from enlisting in the Continental Army or the state militias were treasonous. Punishments ranged from house arrest and suspension of voting privileges to confiscation of property and deportation. Sometimes self-appointed committees of Tory hunters bypassed the judicial process and terrorized Loyalists, raiding their houses or tarring and feathering them. Were wives of Loyalists also traitors? When Loyalist families fled the country, state governments typically confiscated their property. If the wife stayed, courts usually allowed her to keep 1/3 of the property, the amount due her if widowed, and confiscated the rest. Yet, according to the laws of the time, a wife was not a political subject who made choices of her own. She was an extension of her husband's will. After the Revolution, some descendants of refugee Loyalists filed lawsuits to regain property that had entered the family through the mother's inheritance. In one well-publicized Massachusetts case in 1805, the American son of Loyalist refugee Anna Martin recovered her dowry property on the grounds that she had no independent will to be a Loyalist. To the Loyalists, tarring and feathering, property confiscation, deportation, terrorism, and denials of liberty of conscience and of property rights proved the dangers of democratic tyranny. A Boston Loyalist named Mather Byles aptly expressed this point. They call me a brainless Tory, but tell me, which is better, to be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away, or by 3,000 tyrants not a mile away? Byles was soon sentenced to deportation. Throughout the war, probably 7,000 to 8,000 Loyalists fled to England, and 28,000 eventually found refuge in Canada. Many stayed until the war's outcome became clear. In New Jersey, for example, 3,000 felt protected or frightened enough by the occupying British Army in 1776 to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. But then the British drew back to New York City, leaving those loyalists to the mercy of local patriot committees and highlighting the risks of openly declaring one's political allegiance. Despite the support of loyalists in 1776, British forces proved unable to build a winning strategy on their backs. Wars cost money, for arms and ammunition, for food and uniforms, for soldiers' pay, and so much more. The Continental Congress printed money, but its value quickly deteriorated because no precious metals backed the currency. The paper money eventually bottomed out at 1/40th of its face value. States, too, printed money to pay for wartime expenses, throwing more chaos into the wartime economy. As the currency depreciated, the Congress searched for other means to purchase supplies and labor. One method was to borrow hard money, gold or silver coins, from wealthy men in exchange for certificates of debt, public securities, promising repayment with interest. The certificates of debt functioned like present-day government bonds. To pay soldiers, the Congress issued land grant certificates, written promises of land usually located in frontier areas such as central Maine or north of the Ohio River. Both the public securities and the land grant certificates would only have value in the event of a patriot victory. They became forms of negotiable currency and soon depreciated as well. Depreciating currency caused prices to rise. Sellers demanded more money as its value fell. The wartime economy of the late 1770s, with an unreliable currency and dramatic inflation, demoralized Americans everywhere. In 1778, local committees of public safety began to fix prices on essential goods such as flour. Inevitably, some turned this situation to their advantage. Money whose value was falling was better spent quickly. Debts, meanwhile, could be repaid in devalued currency. A brisk black market sprung up in prohibited luxury imports such as tea, sugar, textiles, and wines, even though these goods came from Britain. As the war ground on, its influence extended into ever more aspects of American society. Although Loyalists came from every social sector, some of the most prominent families of the political and economic life of the colonies sided with the empire. Their sudden exclusion from power opened up new opportunities for ambitious men supporting the patriot cause. The economic transformations unleashed by the war added to the turbulence, creating great new fortunes for some, even as policies of land confiscation or simple financial collapse brought down older dynasties. The active roles that women took in the revolutionary effort, in the boycott and homespun movements, for example, or in the Ladies' Association, challenged prevailing gender norms and created new ways for women to think of themselves in political and economic terms. The recruitment of blacks to the Continental Army and of former slaves to the British forces undermined the institution of slavery and challenged the racial ideologies on which slavery rested. Put together, these developments added up to a radical challenge to existing social hierarchies. None of these challenges had been intended by those who initially led the resistance to British imperial policy. But as the movement continued, it gained a momentum of its own, which eventually ran ahead of the political leadership. No one had a monopoly on the rhetoric of liberty and slavery, of tyranny and republicanism. Laborers, slaves, women, and many others began to appropriate the radical language that had become such common currency in the imperial struggle. Although the American Revolution did not lead to wholesale social revolution in the former British colonies, it created a powerful new language of rights on which future generations would build. Over time, the republic governed by elite men established by the Revolution would become a raucous popular democracy. Women, blacks, workers, landless squatters, and many others would deploy the Revolution's rhetoric to claim their rights as citizens. If such movements still lay in the future, one change came immediately and permanently. With the Declaration of Independence's proclamation that governments derived their just powers from the governed, the colonists who had long cherished their identity as subjects of the British king gave up their allegiance to monarchy and never looked back. Even as most claims to citizenship and democracy continue to be the subject of bitter contention in American life, The question of monarchy was never seriously reconsidered. The United States was henceforth to be a republic, and no political movement ever emerged calling for a return to monarchy. Given the relative weakness of the combined Continental Army and state militias, the prospect of securing alliances with certain Indian nations arose, but most members of Congress shared General Washington's distrust of Indians, and in 1775 sent emissaries to the Six Nations and other nations urging them to stay neutral in what they described as a family squabble. The American Revolution was a source of considerable confusion to Indian peoples. The British appeared to have fallen to fighting among themselves. At first, most Indians chose to remain neutral in what they regarded as a family quarrel. But diplomatic and economic pressures rendered neutrality difficult and dangerous. Different motives prompted different groups, but most Indians who fought in the Revolution sided with the British. They recognized that the war was a contest for Indian land as well as for American independence, and their experiences of the land hunger of American settlers convinced them that their best hopes of survival lay in supporting the Crown. In Indian eyes, aggressive Americans posed a greater threat than did a distant king to their land, their liberty, and their way of life. While most Indians eventually sided with the British, Indians in New England who were surrounded by American neighbors mostly supported the Patriot cause. Indians from Massachusetts and Connecticut fought at Bunker Hill. Rebecca Tanner, a Mohegan, lost 5 sons who served in the American Army during the war. Warriors from the mission town of Stockbridge in western Massachusetts were among the first Indians to fight in the conflict, joining Washington's army at the Siege of Boston in 1775. They suffered heavy casualties throughout the war, only to find that their American neighbors had taken over their lands and most of their town while they were away fighting. Other Indian towns in New England also sustained heavy casualties but secured few rewards for their services. Indian peoples knew that Indian lands were at stake in the Revolution. By the war's outbreak in 1775, the Cherokees in the southeast had seen their territory whittled away in a series of treaties, and land speculators and settlers were swarming the ceded lands. Young Cherokee men, frustrated by their fathers' policies of selling land and determined to prevent further erosion of the Cherokee homeland, seized the outbreak of the Revolution as an occasion to drive trespassers off their lands. They staged a coup during the war negotiations at their principal village of Chota in May 1776, joining Northern Shawnee, Delaware, and Mohawk delegates who called for resistance against the revolutionary colonists. Cherokee warriors attacked frontier settlements the following month, but they did so on their own, without British support and against the advice of British agents who urged them to wait until they could coordinate with His Majesty's troops. American forces immediately retaliated, burning Cherokee towns and forcing Cherokee chiefs to sue for peace, which they did at the cost of ceding even more land. The Revolution also shattered the unity of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations in upstate New York who had managed to keep their ancient league intact throughout the French and Indian Wars. The Mohawks, led by War Chief Joseph Brant, supported the Crown, as did most of the Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, but the Oneidas and Tuscaroras leaned toward the Americans. Oneidas fought alongside the Americans while Mohawks and Senecas fought with the British, a devastating development in Iroquois society that was built around clan and kinship ties. Like the Cherokees, many Iroquois lost their homes during the Revolution. Mohawks were driven from the Mohawk Valley, and Oneidas, fleeing retaliation, lived in squalid refugee camps during the rest of the war. American distrust of their Indian allies, coupled with squatters and speculators illegally seizing tribal land, eroded support for the Patriot cause and pushed neutral tribes into the British camp after 1778. In early 1777, the Continental Army's prospects looked bleak. With a mix of luck and skill, General Washington had avoided defeat, but the minor victories in New Jersey lent only faint optimism to the American side. Meanwhile, British troops moved south from Quebec, aiming to isolate New England by taking control of the Hudson River. Their presence drew the Continental Army up into central New York, turning the Mohawk Valley into a bloody war zone and polarizing the Iroquois. By 1779, Native American nations in the Ohio Valley were fully involved in the war, which for them had become a struggle to maintain their territory from settler encroachments. A major American victory at Saratoga led France to join the American struggle for independence, turning it into another global war for imperial dominance between Europe's two greatest military powers. Benedict Arnold struggled to gain the recognition from Congress that he believed he deserved for his bravery in Canada and on Lake Champlain, even though Washington called him in letters between them, "my best fighting officer." Some under his command bristled at his impatience and demanding nature, while others accused him of recklessness in battle. This led to Congress passing him over for promotion, even as it promoted others who had far less distinguished service records. He took an extended leave to attend to business matters back in Connecticut before accepting command of the Army's protective garrison in Philadelphia in the spring of 1777. When he received news of British movements toward their invasion of New York, he requested to join General Horatio Gates in preparing to engage the main British Army in the Northern Theater, but Gates refused the request. Outraged, Arnold submitted his resignation to General Washington, who refused to accept it and ordered Gates to detach Arnold from his duties in Philadelphia. As it turned out, this was a fateful decision. British General John Burgoyne began the northern squeeze on the Hudson River Valley. His army of 8,400 troops, including some 400 Mohawk warriors, descended from Canada with the objective of capturing Albany, near the intersection of the Hudson and Mohawk rivers. Burgoyne's army did not travel light. In addition to 1,000 camp followers, cooks, laundresses, musicians, etc., who followed along, Burgoyne's troops dragged a store of heavy artillery across a dense, roadless forest. In July, Burgoyne captured Fort Ticonderoga. American troops spotted the approaching British and abandoned the fort without a fight. The British continued south, but they lost a month hacking their way through the dense forests. Supply lines back to Canada were severely stretched, and local militia units harassed British soldiers sent out to forage for food. Others felled trees and dammed streams and rivers to slow Burgoyne's progress. The next step in isolating New England should have been to send troops up the Hudson from New York City to meet Burgoyne. American surveillance indicated that General Howe in Manhattan was readying his men for a major move in August 1777. But Howe surprised everyone by sailing south to attack Philadelphia instead. Arnold joined Gates at Albany in preparation for the engagement with Burgoyne when word arrived of the westward approach of British General Barry St. Leger's 1,700 regulars, Loyalist militia, and Indian auxiliaries heading down the Mohawk Valley to reinforce Burgoyne. Arnold rushed with 950 Continentals and militiamen to support Colonel Nicholas Herkimer of the New York militia. Arnold used spies to disinform the British allied Iroquois warriors that the main body of the Continental Army in the north was approaching to crush them, and most of them abandoned St. Leger. Together, Arnold and Herkimer retook Fort Stanwix, forcing St. Leger to retreat back into Canada and robbing Burgoyne of much-needed reinforcements. The Battle of Oriskany and Battle of Fort Stanwix highlighted the ways in which the American Revolution was a complex and multi-ethnic civil war. They pitted German Americans against Hessian missionaries, New York patriots against New York Loyalists, English Americans against British soldiers, and Oneida Iroquois against Mohawk warriors. The British retreat at Fort Stanwix deprived General Burgoyne of critical reinforcements. Camped at the small village of Saratoga, isolated at the foot of the Adirondack Mountains, his food supplies dwindling and his men beginning to desert, Burgoyne's position became desperate. Sensing opportunity, American General Horatio Gates began moving his army towards Saratoga. Arnold rushed back to join Gates at Saratoga, but the problem with Gates was that while he was an excellent administrator, he was not an inspiring leader on the field. He was also very cautious, and with the approaching British and the entrenched American armies being roughly of equal size, Gates refused to agree with Arnold that the Americans had the initiative and should attack before Burgoyne could gather his miles-long columns into proper formations. Burgoyne did as much to weaken his position as American partisans did to slow his advance southward. He warned Hudson Valley residents not to join the gathering American army or otherwise hinder him, or he would unleash his Indian auxiliaries on them. This increased the numbers of New York and New England militia who streamed into Saratoga to swell the American numbers. Learning of a large store of munitions at Bennington, Vermont, Burgoyne ordered 2 Hessian units to seize it. American spies told the Hessian officers that they would likely encounter armed colonials near the town, but that they were Loyalist militia intending to help them. This was a ruse, and the 1,300 Germans were surrounded by 2,400 militia and routed. Back at Saratoga, Burgoyne chose to attack first, and the British prevailed, but at the cost of 600 dead or wounded and no clear winner in this first battle of Saratoga. A couple of weeks after this first skirmish, the Americans now outnumbered the British by almost 2-1, and Arnold urged Gates to attack, but again Gates refused. Arnold accused his commander of cowardice, and Gates relieved him of command, at which point Arnold took it upon himself to take command of the entire operation, ordering the Americans to advance on the British positions at Bemis Heights. He ordered Colonel Daniel Morgan to position his famed riflemen in the trees around the western edge of the battlefield to snipe at the British officers in direct violation of the traditional rules of engagement that would protect officers. The Americans, with Arnold leading the charge, attacked the British artillery emplacements, and they were successful. The killing of many British officers by Morgan's riflemen disordered the British ranks. Arnold himself had his horse shot out from under him while taking a redoubt, the bullet wounding the same leg that he had seriously wounded at Quebec. He was forced to retire from the field to a surgeon's tent, where again a doctor prepared to amputate the leg, and again Arnold refused, insisting that the ball be dug out. Miraculously, the operation was successful, though Arnold spent months fighting infection and struggling to rehabilitate. He had to walk with a cane for the rest of his life. In the meantime, Gates realized that his army was winning and led the final assault that forced Burgoyne, who realized that no reinforcements were coming as the American ranks continued to grow, to surrender on October 17th. In his official report, Gates chastised Arnold for his insubordination and neglected to mention his critical role in the American victory, though others did comment on it in letters and later recollections. The Battle of Saratoga may officially be Gates's victory, but it was Benedict Arnold who achieved it. Saratoga was the first great victory for the Continental Army and sparked celebrations throughout the colonies. General Howe, meanwhile, succeeded in occupying Philadelphia in September 1777. Calculating that the capture of Philadelphia compensated for the loss at Saratoga, the British government proposed a negotiated settlement, not including independence, to end the war. No doubt the Continental Congress would have accepted the offer 18 months earlier, but no longer. The Americans refused. Independence had now become the objective of the war, a cause they increasingly understood religiously as bound up with a greater quest for human freedom. If American spirits ran high after Burgoyne's defeat, supplies of arms and food ran precariously low. Washington moved his troops into winter quarters at Valley Forge, just west of Philadelphia. Quartered in drafty huts, the soldiers lacked blankets, boots, stockings, and food. Meanwhile, evidence of corruption and profiteering was abundant. Army suppliers too often provided defective food, clothing, and gunpowder. One shipment of bedding arrived with blankets 1/4 their customary size. Food supplies arrived rotten. As one Continental officer said, quote, "The people at home are destroying the army by their conduct much faster than Howe and all his army can possibly do by fighting us." End quote. Some 2,000 men died of disease that terrible winter, while another 2,000 men deserted. "These are the times that try men's souls," wrote Thomas Paine in a pamphlet intended to shore up morale. "Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods," he added, "and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated." Between the fall of 1777 and summer of 1778, the fighting on the Atlantic coast slowed. But in the American backcountry, the foothills and valleys on both sides of the Appalachian Mountains, including the Mohawk Valley, the Ohio Valley, and Kentucky, a war of Indians against the American rebels heated up. Native Americans in these regions fought to protect their sovereignty, their independence, and their traditional culture in a mirror image of the Americans' quest for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If the war in the East was a struggle for independence from empire, the war in the West was a struggle for imperial conquest. Loyalists and Indians raided Patriot settlements throughout 1778. In retaliation, American militiamen destroyed Mohawk villages, killing several children. In May 1779, General Washington, demonstrating a general disregard for understanding the difference between Indian friend from Indian foe, he ordered the total destruction and devastation of the Iroquois villages of central New York, populated mostly by American allied Oneidas and neutral Cayugas. General John Sullivan commanded 4,500 troops that launched the campaign of total war that summer and fall. The goal was to burn Indian villages and food and starve those the army did not kill. 40 Indian towns met with complete obliteration. Continental soldiers torched dwellings, cornfields, and orchards, as well as slaughtering animals. In some towns, they slaughtered women and children, although inhabitants in most managed to escape. Thousands of Indian refugees, sick and starving, fled to Fort Niagara, where they remained for one of the most miserable winters on record. Farther west, a complex story of alliances and betrayals between American militiamen and Native Americans unfolded. Some 150,000 American Indian people lived between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, and by 1779, neutrality was no longer a viable option. Most sided with the British, but a portion of the Shawnee and Delaware nations first sought peace with the Americans. In mid-1778, the Delaware chief White Eyes negotiated a treaty at Fort Pitt, pledging his people's support for the American cause in exchange for supplies and trade goods. Escalating violence soon undermined the agreement. That fall, when American soldiers killed Cornstalk and Red Hawk, two friendly Shawnee chiefs, the Continental Congress hastened to apologize, as did the governors of Pennsylvania and Virginia. But the soldiers who stood trial for the murders were acquitted. 2 months later, White Eyes died under mysterious circumstances, almost certainly murdered by militiamen who refused to distinguish between allied and enemy Indians. In these borderland areas, the Revolution was turning into a racial war of extermination. West of North Carolina, in present-day Tennessee, American militias attacked Cherokee settlements in 1778, destroying 36 villages. The Cherokee responded by striking American settlements such as Boonesboro in present-day Kentucky. In retaliation, a young Virginian named George Rogers Clark led Kentucky militiamen into Illinois country, attacking and taking the British fort at Kaskaskia. Although Clark's men wore native clothing, hunting shirts and breechcloths, their dress did not signal any solidarity with the Indians. When they attacked British-held Fort Vincennes in 1779, Clark's troops tomahawked Indian captives and threw their still live bodies into the river in a gory spectacle witnessed by British troops. By 1780, few American Indians remained neutral. Violent raids by Americans drove Indians into the arms of the British at Forts Detroit and Niagara, or to the Spaniards, who controlled forts west of the Mississippi River. Rare as it was, Indian support for the American side occasionally emerged out of a strategic sense that the Americans were unstoppable in their westward pressure and that it was better to forge an alliance than to lose a war. But for most native peoples, it was gradually becoming clear that an American victory portended a grim future. On their own, the Americans could not have won the war, especially as pressure from hostile Indians increased. But the military context changed dramatically after the Americans' victory at Saratoga. In February 1778, France recognized the United States as an independent nation in the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, promising full military and commercial support. The French treasury injected desperately needed funds for the American war effort. Most crucially, the French Navy now joined the American war, challenging British sea power while providing essential supplies and troop reinforcements from across the Atlantic. Well before 1778, the French had been covertly providing Americans with cannons, muskets, gunpowder, and military advisors. For French authorities, the rebellion in the British colonies provided an ideal opportunity to strike a crippling blow against the British Empire. A victory would detach the lucrative colonial trade from Britain and reorient it to France, while also providing France with military bases on the American mainland and supplies for its immensely profitable Caribbean colonies. Even an American defeat would be a strategic victory for France if it drained Britain of men and money and weakened the British Empire. With the French alliance, the American Revolution expanded beyond a war for independence of 13 British colonies. It now became another global war in the century-long struggle between the French and British empires. At the prodding of French diplomats, Spain entered the war in 1779, fighting battles along the Gulf of Mexico and competing with Britain for the alliance of American Indian nations in the southeastern backcountry. The Netherlands entered the fighting in 1782 when they formally recognized the United States at the cost of launching the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. By the time the fighting spread from the Caribbean to Europe and Asia, the American Revolution had long since ceased to concern just one country or even one continent. When France entered the war, some British officials thought it was time to abandon the fight, but the king could not tolerate the thought of losing his North American colonies. He pushed for a new strategy focusing on the southern colonies, thought to be more reliably Loyalist. He had little idea of the depth of anger that deadly guerrilla warfare would produce between Loyalists and Patriots. The king's plan was shrewd, but desperate and ultimately unsuccessful. The new strategy called for British forces to abandon New England to focus on the South. Georgia and the Carolinas appeared to hold large numbers of Loyalists, providing a base of popular support on which to build the British war effort. British leaders also counted on the region's large slave population to push rebellious white Southerners back into the arms of the empire. Georgia, the first target, fell easily at the end of December 1778. With most of the Continental Army in the north, while the French were fighting in the West Indies, British troops had a free hand. A small army of soldiers occupied Savannah and Augusta, installing a new royal governor and Loyalist assembly. The British organized 20 loyal militia units, and 1,400 Georgians swore an oath of allegiance to the king. A joint Franco-American force, which included hundreds of troops of color from the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, later Haiti, tried to retake Savannah in the fall of 1779. They failed after a bloody series of battles. Britain's southern strategy was off to a promising start. Next came South Carolina. The Continental Army sent 10 regiments to Charleston to defend the port city from attack by British troops under the command of General Henry Clinton, who had replaced Howe as commander-in-chief. For 5 weeks in early spring 1780, the British laid siege to the city. They took it in May 1780, capturing 3,300 American soldiers. Clinton began offering freedom to slaves owned by rebellious whites. Several thousand escaped Charleston. Untrained in formal warfare, they served as guides to the countryside and as laborers building defensive fortifications. Freed slaves with boat piloting skills were particularly valuable in navigating the inland rivers of the southern colonies. Clinton returned to New York after the fall of Charleston, leaving the job of pacifying the rest of South Carolina to General Charles Cornwallis and 4,000 troops. A bold commander, Lord Cornwallis quickly chased out the remaining Continentals and established military rule over South Carolina. He purged rebels from government office and disarmed rebel militias. Exports of rice, South Carolina's main crop, resumed, and pardons were offered to Carolinians willing to take up arms for the British. In August, American troops arrived from the north to strike back at Cornwallis. General Gates led 3,000 troops in an assault on Camden, South Carolina. Many of Gates's soldiers were newly recruited militiamen. They panicked at the sight of the approaching British cavalry and fled. When regiment leaders tried to regroup the next day, only 700 soldiers mustered for duty. The Battle of Camden was a devastating defeat. American prospects had rarely looked worse. Ironically, the French alliance proved to be the last straw for Benedict Arnold. A fervent Presbyterian who had been raised by a pious mother enraptured by the preachers of the First Great Awakening, Arnold believed that the United States had made a fatal deal with the devil in order to win independence. Citing the bickering in Congress over war appropriations, its lack of recognition of his achievements, especially after Saratoga, that kept him just short of becoming a full general in the Continental Army, he lost faith in the American Revolution. As commander of the garrison in Philadelphia, he decided to use his position to make some money since his business in Connecticut floundered during his absence. He also fell in love with Peggy Shippen, whose family were prominent Loyalists, marrying her in 1779. In the meantime, he got into trouble for his profiteering and put to a court-martial that cleared him of the worst charges, but concluded that he had not fully accounted for his expenses during the Quebec expedition and that he owed the United States 1,000 pounds. Washington formally reprimanded him, and Arnold angrily resigned his post in Philadelphia. Possibly through Peggy's influence, he decided to defect to the British in spring 1780. They tested his willingness to betray his country by asking him to hand over the key fortress at West Point, north of New York City. He requested a transfer from General Washington that was granted, and then connived with a British officer, Major John Andre, to surrender the fort. The handover was to take place in September 1780, but as fate would have it, on the day that Arnold was to meet Major Andre, General Washington unexpectedly showed up at West Point to meet his best fighting officer. They had a very nervous dinner, at the end of which Arnold hastily excused himself because he had to leave to hand over the plans of the fort and other information to Andre. Later, Peggy became nearly hysterical with fear and anxiety, though of course she could not tell General Washington why, and he tried his best to calm her down, obviously wondering what was going on. The fact was that Benedict and Peggy were terrified that Washington would be captured, and they didn't want this because Washington had been practically Arnold's only real supporter. In any case, Andre was intercepted by American partisans who found the plans Arnold gave him in his boot. The plot was uncovered, Andre was executed as a spy, and Arnold's role completely exposed. Washington was said to have flown into a tearful rage upon hearing the news. Arnold tried to justify his defection in an open letter to the American people, citing the French alliance as a terrible mistake that would see the United States become de facto French colonies where Catholicism would be imposed on the people. His arguments rang hollow, but I think that he was sincere in his sentiment, though in the end, if he had just been promoted to general and fully cleared of the charges in the court-martial, he would never have defected. As it was, the British made him a brigadier general and put him in command of Loyalist militia in New England, forcing him to lead raids on cities and towns in Rhode Island and his home state of Connecticut. Shock over Gates's defeat at Camden and Arnold's treason revitalized rebel support in western South Carolina. Cornwallis considered the area pacified and loyal. He was soon proven wrong, as the southern backcountry became the site of vicious guerrilla warfare. It was the Carolina backcountry that saw the worst aspects of the war for independence. Populated mostly by clannish Scots-Irish settlers and their immediate descendants, people governed themselves more by family loyalties than by obeying their representatives in the capitals of Charleston and Newburgh. Political affiliation was determined more by who your enemies affiliated with, and the war provided numerous opportunities for feuding clans to settle scores and for some to prey upon others for material gain. Ruthless guerrilla bands roamed the mountains and Piedmont regions, some claiming allegiance to the Patriots, others to the Loyalists, and still others pretending to be one or the other as the situation suited them, and all attacking one another in bloody skirmishes and pilfering raids. A British officer attached to Cornwallis's army near Eutaw Springs was leading a foraging party that came upon an abandoned plantation house that had clearly been ransacked. In an upstairs bedroom, the corpse of a young woman was found tied to a bed, her abdomen cut open and a grim message written on the wall above her in blood, "Thou shalt not give birth to Tories." Soldiers later found a fetus hanging by its umbilical cord in the limbs of a peach tree nearby. Partisan bands rarely took prisoners, but when they did, they routinely tortured them and held them for ransom. Some they subjected to a procedure called spitting. A small plank of wood would have a large nail driven through it, which then would be nailed onto the bare foot of a prisoner, who would then be forced to walk with his captors to wherever they were going. Official and anecdotal accounts speak of these and many other atrocities that shredded the social fabric of the backcountry. But partisans were not the only ones with a reputation for brutality. Colonel Bannister Tarleton led an organized Loyalist unit that became infamous for slaughtering wounded and surrendering enemy troops, and pillaging the countryside to the detriment of friend and foe alike. Britain's southern strategy depended on Loyalist support to hold reconquered territory as Cornwallis's army moved north. The backcountry civil war rendered this assumption false. The British might continue holding a few fortified outposts along the coast, but they could not conquer the vast countryside. The Americans won few major battles, but they succeeded by harassing British forces and preventing them from foraging for food. Cornwallis moved the war into North Carolina in the fall of 1780 because the North Carolinians were supplying the South Carolina rebels with arms and men. Then news of a massacre of Loyalist units by 1,400 frontier riflemen at the Battle of Kings Mountain in western South Carolina sent him hurrying back. Without a secure base of Loyalist support, the British were stretched too thin to hold even 2 colonies. How could they hope to hold a continent? By early 1781, Britain's hopes to hold its 13 colonies were dimming. The brutal defeat at Kings Mountain was quickly followed by a second major loss in South Carolina in January 1781. Cornwallis headed to North Carolina and then to Virginia, where he captured Williamsburg in June. A raiding party proceeded to Charlottesville, the seat of government, capturing members of the Virginia Assembly, but not Governor Thomas Jefferson, who fled just minutes before the British soldiers arrived. These victories led Cornwallis to believe that his campaign of raids in Virginia was succeeding. With some 4,000 escaped slaves swelling the size of his army, a newly confident Cornwallis marched to Yorktown near the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. As the general waited for reinforcements by sea, smallpox and typhus began to set in among the black recruits. At this crucial moment, the Franco-American alliance came into play. French regiments commanded by the Comte de Rochambeau had joined General Washington in Newport, Rhode Island in mid-1780. In early 1781, warships under the Comte de Grasse had sailed from France to the West Indies. Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse now fixed their attention on Chesapeake Bay and on Cornwallis's vulnerable army. De Grasse's fleet arrived at the mouth of the bay ahead of the British troop ships from New York. After a 5-day battle, the French Navy gained control of the Virginia coast, cutting off British reinforcements. Cornwallis's army was trapped. With enemy forces to their front and water at their back, General Cornwallis and his 7,500 troops faced a combined French and American army of 16,000 at the Battle of Yorktown. For 12 days, the Franco-American force bombarded the British fortifications at Yorktown as French military engineers methodically directed the siege of the British position. Cornwallis ran low on food and ammunition. He began to expel the black recruits, some of them sick and dying. Finally, Cornwallis was forced to confront the inevitable. Neither victory nor escape was possible. He surrendered on October 19, 1781. For all intents and purposes, American independence had been won. The surrender at Yorktown ended British hopes of getting the 13 rebellious colonies back into the empire. Nonetheless, 2 more years of fighting continued across the continent and around the globe. Frontier areas in Kentucky, Ohio, and Illinois blazed with battles pitting American forces against American Indian nations fighting to maintain control of their homelands. Meanwhile, war between France and Great Britain continued in the Caribbean and India, while the Spanish, who had joined the war alongside the French, fought to regain the strategic fort of Gibraltar at the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea. The Netherlands, which had also entered the war against Britain, fought in Europe and India. For nearly 2 years, the Continental Army camped at Newburgh, some 60 miles north of British-occupied New York City. As the bored and restless soldiers waited for news of a peace treaty, they grew angrier about the Congress's inability to pay their salaries. An earlier promise of generous pensions, half pay for life, made in 1780 in a desperate attempt to retain the officers, seemed increasingly doubtful. In December 1782, these frustrations boiled over as officers petitioned the Congress for immediate back pay for their men. The petition darkly hinted that failure to pay the men may have fatal effects. Many whispered out loud that they wanted to see General Washington replaced as commander-in-chief with General Horatio Gates. Instead of rejecting the petition outright, several members of the Congress saw an opportunity to pressure the states to grant the Confederation government greater taxation powers. One of these was Robert Morris, a Philadelphia merchant with a gift for financial dealings. As the Congress's superintendent of finance, Morris kept the books and wheedled loans from European bankers using his own substantial fortune as collateral. To forestall total insolvency, Morris led an effort in 1781 to amend the Articles of Confederation to allow collection of a 5% impost, an import tax. It failed by 1 vote, illustrating the difficulty of achieving unanimity and highlighting the Confederation government's weaknesses. The officers' petition offered new prospects to make the case for taxation. A more influential figure in what is called the Newburgh Conspiracy was none other than Alexander Hamilton, who had been Washington's aide-de-camp and personal secretary before his election to Congress in 1782. As he wrote the many letters Washington signed, begging Congress for money and supplies throughout the war, he tried to convince Washington that Congress could have paid for the war if it had the power to impose direct taxes, a possibility Washington sternly rejected. Morris and Hamilton, along with several other congressmen, encouraged the officers to march the army on the Congress to demand its pay. The plot's leaders did not envision a real coup. They wanted to augment the Congress's power of taxation, but the risks were extraordinary. For the plan to succeed, most soldiers and officers could not know the plot was a ruse. What if they took the coup to heart? General Washington, sympathetic to the plight of unpaid soldiers and officers, had approved the initial petition, but the plotters, aware of his reputation for integrity, kept him in the dark about their collusion with congressional leaders. When the general learned of these developments in March 1783, he composed an emotional speech to a meeting of 500 officers. He pulled his speech out of his pocket and then did something extraordinary, something nobody but those of his inner circle had ever seen. "Gentlemen, you will permit me," he began, "to put on my spectacles, for not only have I grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." In the 18th century, almost no public figure of Washington's stature permitted themselves to be seen needing to wear glasses to read except for Benjamin Franklin, who wears a pair of the bifocals he invented in portraits painted later in his life. Murmuring immediately ran through the crowd of officers, and this supreme piece of political theater began to work. He could have stopped there in all likelihood, but he had taken the time to write a speech, and so he continued. "Let me conjure you," he implored, "as you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes, under any specious pretenses, to overturn the liberties of our country." His audience was left speechless and tearful. Washington, who might have chosen to march his army on the Capitol, overthrow the Congress, and install himself at the head of the nation, ended the plot instead. Few could now doubt his virtue, and his fame grew to new heights. The Treaty of Paris, also called the Peace of Paris, was 2 years in the making. Commissioners from America and Britain worked out the 10 Articles of Peace, while a side treaty signed by Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands sealed related deals. Importantly, while Congress instructed Benjamin Franklin, the head of the delegation, not to make any agreements with Britain without first consulting the French, he made sure that the French were kept in the dark, and the treaty signed between the United States and Britain was done largely without the French knowledge or approval. The first article went to the heart of the cause. His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States to be free, sovereign, and independent states. It was a catastrophic defeat for Britain and a devastating personal blow for King George III. It marked a new era in the history of the British Empire. Another article set the western boundary of the United States at the Mississippi River, overturning the boundaries that had been laid out in the Quebec Act of 1774 and blithely ignoring the territorial claims of Britain's American Indian allies. Still another provision prohibited the British from carrying away any slaves or other property of the American inhabitants, although they too had fought as loyal subjects of the British Empire. The treaty was signed on September 3, 1783. If most white Americans celebrated news of the treaty, the thousands of self-liberated blacks who had joined the British under promise of freedom were horrified. South Carolinian Boston King, a refugee in New York City, recalled that the provision prohibiting evacuation of black refugees, quote, "filled us with inexpressible anguish and terror," end quote. King and others pressed the British commander in New York, Sir Guy Carleton, to honor pre-treaty British promises. Carleton obliged, issuing certificates of freedom for all refugees under British protection for more than a year, nullifying their status as property to be returned. More than 4,000 blacks sailed out of New York for Nova Scotia, Boston King and his family among them. As Carleton coolly explained to a protesting George Washington, quote, "The Negroes in question I found free when I arrived at New York. I had therefore no right, as I thought, to prevent their going to any part of the world they thought proper," end quote. British commanders in Savannah and Charleston sold approximately 4,000 blacks to plantations on the British Sugar Islands. Emancipation had never been a war goal of Great Britain, whose colonies in the Caribbean ran on brutalizing slave labor. The British policy promising freedom to slaves of rebellious planters aimed to destabilize the Patriot cause and gain necessary manpower. For their part, slaves viewed British Army camps as sites of refuge, not figuring on the devastations of epidemic diseases and food shortages. Although some came to venerate the British monarchy as a harbinger of liberty, for many others their loyalty to the British Empire was essentially transactional, while others had good cause to feel betrayed. The Treaty of Paris said nothing about American Indian territorial rights. It was a great betrayal of Great Britain's Indian allies who had played an essential role in the war, but none in the treaty negotiations. The boundary lines drawn on maps in Europe did not change facts on the ground, however. American Indian nations remained in firm control of their traditional homelands in the vast territory stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. The Treaty of Paris brought no peace to those regions. If the colonists had won their struggle for independence from Britain, American Indians would continue fighting an ongoing war for their own independence from American settler encroachment for years to come. With the treaty signed, the British began evacuating New York, Charleston, and Savannah, a process complicated by the sheer numbers involved: soldiers, loyalists, and escaped slaves by the thousands. In New York City, more than 27,000 soldiers and 30,000 loyalists sailed on hundreds of ships for England in the fall of 1783. In a final act of mischief, the losing side raised the British flag at the southern tip of Manhattan, cut the ropes used to hoist it, greased the flagpole, and sailed away. While some in Congress levied an empty threat that Washington might seize power as a means of increasing its own powers, some in Congress privately admitted that they expected, some even hoped, that he might do just that and install himself as King George I of America. After all, that's what victorious generals have done for centuries, most famously Julius Caesar. But Washington was a smarter politician than that. He bade farewell to the army and traveled alone to Annapolis, Maryland, where Congress was then in session, in December 1783, and resigned his commission. Again, it was a consummate act of political theater, and it sent Washington's reputation soaring into the stratosphere. Who voluntarily gives up that kind of power, refuses the temptation to become a king when there would have been little or no ability on the part of Congress to prevent it? While Washington declared that he was done with public life and that he expected to live out the rest of his life as a private citizen, nobody really believed it, least of all Washington himself. The British began the war for America convinced they could not lose. They had the best trained army and navy in the world. They knew the landscape. Their American Indian allies dominated the backcountry, and they easily captured every port city of consequence in America. 2/3 of the colonists were either neutral or loyal to the crown. Why, then, did the Americans win? Difficult supply lines were one continuing problem. British forces depended on a steady stream of ships from across the Atlantic Ocean, and insecurity about food helps explain their reluctance to pursue the Continental Army aggressively. A second obstacle was their continual misuse of Loyalist energies. Any plan to pacify the colonies required the cooperation of the Loyalists, but the British repeatedly left them to the mercy of vengeful rebels. French intervention also explains the British defeat. Even before the formal alliance, French artillery, ammunition, and money proved vital to the Continental Army. After 1780, the French army fought alongside the Americans, and the French Navy made the Yorktown victory possible. The British abdicated civil power in the colonies in 1775 and 1776 when royal officials fled to safety, and they never regained it. The basic British goal, to turn back the clock to imperial rule, receded into impossibility as the war dragged on. Finally, the British were unsure how to prosecute the war on the ground, and confused about how to proceed after what they thought would be their inevitable victory. British generals proved more willing to squabble and compete with each other than coordinate to defeat the rebels. A combination of arrogance and strategic confusion and the widening of the conflict meant that the United States did not so much win the war for independence so much as Great Britain lost it. The Revolution profoundly disrupted the lives of all Americans. It was a war for colonial independence from Britain, to be sure, but it was also more. It was a global war among Europe's most powerful empires. For Native Americans, it was a central event in their ongoing struggle to regain control of their territories. For the former British colonists, it was also a social revolution. It required men and women to think about politics and the legitimacy of authority. The rhetoric employed to justify the war against Britain put the words liberty, tyranny, slavery, independence, and equality into common usage. These terms carried far deeper meanings than a mere complaint over taxation without representation. The revolution unleashed a dynamic of equality and liberty that was largely unintended and unwanted by many of the political leaders of 1776. But that dynamic emerged as a potent force in American life in the decades to come. By way of conclusion, let me tell you a little story about Benedict Arnold, who retired to London after the war, never receiving the positive acknowledgement of his skills from the British that he had craved from the Americans apart from George Washington. In the 1790s, he ran into an old friend in a tavern and they sat down to catch up. After a few rounds, Arnold asked his friend about any possibility that he might be able to come back to live in his beloved Connecticut again, and his friend firmly denied that such a thing would be possible. Were he to return to the United States, his friend half-jokingly predicted, he would be arrested, tried and found guilty of treason, and then executed, but that the leg that he wounded at Quebec and Saratoga would be severed and buried with full military honors. Needless to say, Arnold lived out the rest of his life in exile. But then, in 1887, on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Saratoga, a Civil War veteran and historian of the battle paid to have a curious monument erected on the site of what was Bremen's redoubt. It looks like a tombstone, but on one side is a relief sculpture of a lower right leg, and on the other side is an epitaph that reads, "In memory of the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army, who was desperately wounded on this spot, the sally port of Burgoyne's great western redoubt, 7th October 1777, winning for his countrymen the decisive battle of the American Revolution, and for himself the rank of Major General." Clearly, the monument commemorates Benedict Arnold's critical contribution to winning the single most important battle of the War for Independence to date, but they couldn't bring themselves to put his name on it. That signifies the degree to which Arnold's defection pained the American psyche. His name became synonymous with betrayal and faithlessness, whereas before, even if Horatio Gates and too many members of Congress refused to admit it, he was indeed the Revolution's most brilliant soldier. Several officers in the Continental Army defected to the British during the war, but we don't know their names offhand because they were undistinguished men whose service contributed little or nothing to American victory. But Arnold's actions at Saratoga swung the war in favor of the United States decisively, brought France in as a powerful ally, and made a critical difference to the outcome of the war. Most people who pass by this monument have no idea what it's about, but those in the know call it the Arnold Monument, and so, in a strange way, part of his friend's prediction came true.